one of the world's most criticised polluters, Australia has formally adopted a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and it joins other countries around the world in promising to make the nation carbon neutral by then. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made the long-delayed pledge after bargaining with resistant MPs within his government.
Australians want action on climate change. They're taking action on climate change, but they also want to protect their jobs and their livelihoods. They also want to keep the costs of living down, and they also want to protect the Australian way of life, especially in rural and regional areas.
Well, Australia is one of the world's biggest exporters of fossil fuels, and in 2020 the export value of coal alone was worth approximately $40 billion. It is one of Australia's leading export commodities. And controversially, Scott Morrison has said there is no plan to limit Australia's fossil fuel sector. Now, he did announce an investment of more than $15 billion in low emissions technologies over the next 20 years, such as efforts to capture carbon in soil, lower solar energy costs, and also developing greener industries. But Australia will also use more gas, at least in the short term. Now, the nation is also not set ambitious targets for 2030. That's an objective of next month's COP26 Global Climate Summit. And we want to get a little bit more analysis now from our correspondent in Sydney, Shaima Khalil.
It took months of political wrangling, but the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has finally announced that Australia will adopt the target of zero carbon emissions by 2050, and that he will be taking the government's plan to the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. Now, the fact that it took so long and has been left down to the wire with days before the summit tells you how complicated this process is and how politically divisive climate action is in Australia. Essentially, the government needed the support of its junior coalition partner, the National Party. They represent electorates in regional and rural Australia, where most of the carbon-intensive industries are, like the coal mining industry, for example. And after days of toing and froing and talks and political concessions made by the government, the Nationals have said we support this process, and this is why the leadership has now been able to stand up and say in no uncertain terms that they are adopting zero emissions by 2050. The Prime Minister said that this is going to be done through technology, not taxes. He addressed regional Australia directly and said that this plan will be achieved not by shutting down coal and gas production or exports, rather by investing billions and billions of dollars in low emission technologies, in building on Australia's solar power success. The government's plan will strike that balance. But he did not make it clear how the government is going to strike that balance, how they plan to keep coal mining, for example, and also achieve net zero by 2050, especially that they have not budged on their 2030 targets. Many have criticized them for being too low, too modest, and just don't reflect the urgency of the climate situation at the moment.
Thanks so much to Shaima Khalil there. Well, let's go to Melbourne live and speak to Kelly O'Shaughnessy, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Conservation Foundation. They are an environmental organisation. Great to have you with us live from Melbourne. Your reaction first to Scott Morrison's announcement.
Hi, Nola. Well, we're really happy that we have a net zero emissions target in Australia by 2050. We've been trying to get this for decades. A lot of climate wars, a lot of politics got in the way. So that is a good thing. But unfortunately, there was not much else other than that announcement today. There's no real plan. It's more of a pamphlet than a plan. There's no new action. There's no new policy. And there's no decent target for 2030, and we all know what really matters with climate change is to cut emissions this decade, because global warming is real, climate damage is here now, particularly in Australia where we're facing these terrible bushfires and droughts. So we need to get serious this decade.
You know, but what I found really interesting, I'd be really curious for your thoughts as you are in Australia, that he didn't want to disrupt the Australian way of life. And I think that was part of the plan for 2050 instead of 2030 in putting those figures forward. How do you understand that? I mean, I was thinking is that, you know, a lot of people's livelihoods are caught up in fossil fuels. The way they make a living is through fossil fuels.
Well, a small number of Australians make their living through fossil fuels, but they are an important bunch of Australians. Most of us, make our living from other industries, but the reality is the world is moving away from coal and gas. So the Australian way of life in terms of the coal miners and gas miners, they are going to lose their jobs unless we actually help them transition into the industries of the future. That's what we need to do, putting our heads in the sand that will continue to export coal and gas to a world that's moving away from it, is really putting these people at risk and their livelihoods at risk. So our way of life is we love the outdoors, we've got a great country, but it's hot here, it's dangerous here. A couple of summers ago, 14 million people were breathing in toxic smoke and could not go outside. That's more than half the Australian population. So our way of life is threatened by climate change.
Just very briefly, I mean, I'm sure Scott Morrison would say he will take the public's opinion. And I'm wondering, by putting these targets, perhaps Australians are not pushing him for faster changes to emissions, for example?
Well, actually, we just did Australia's largest climate poll, 15,000 people, which is 3 times bigger than any climate poll ever done in the country. It showed that 61% of Australians want our government to at least halve emissions in Australia by 2030. Only 39% stuck with the current plan. So Aussies want action. In fact, the federal government is the last of the states and territories, all industry bodies and the Australian people to be saying, hey, come on, let's get on with this, because acting on climate change will make our lives safer, but it's actually going to bring jobs and wealth to our country.
Kelly O'Shaughnessy, thank you so much, speaking to us from Melbourne.